First and foremost, I just want to, thank everybody for coming out tonight, and the university, of course, Wayne Law, for allowing us to come out and share our stories. So I guess I'll just start with a little bit about myself. My name is Miles Folsom. I've come from the Midwest. I currently live in Indiana. I'm 30 years old. At the age of 15, I assaulted and robbed somebody during a drug deal, and ultimately, what I was convicted of gave me a 36-year sentence in the Indiana Department of Corrections. Now, again, that sentence was given to me when I was 16, and that's also when I arrived into a maximum security prison. Now, I thought today a lot about, the audience and, my life experiences and, what could I tell you in this moment? Most of you, I'm assuming, are up-and-coming legal scholars, judges, so on and so forth. And so what could I relay to you that would be most impactful? Because I got a whole life of stuff that I could tell, the good, the bad. But, you being the future custodians of our jurisprudence, there's one story that really comes to mind that I wanted to share with you today. And then, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. But, it was 7 years ago. I was 23 years old. And I was living in a maximum security prison in southern Indiana. And I'd been hired to work in a law library. Now, depending on the hour of the day or, the week, or the day of the week, rather, you would have, patrons coming in from all over the prison trying to find legal assistance for their claims, or even to defend themselves against these, new charges that might come post-incarceration. And then even still, some, they just wanted help reading their legal work because some just couldn't even comprehend it. The legalese that I'm sure many new students sort of, find themselves swamped within, a whole book of dictionary terms that you need to understand to even fight your own case. And so as I sat there, people would come in and they would ask me for help, filing a post-conviction or a sentence modification or a child support modification, whatever it may be. You never know who's going to walk through the door and what kind of help they're going to need. And so, you take one guy's paperwork and you read through it. And I'm not sure how many case studies, some of you students or maybe even the professors hand out, but something that quickly grabbed a hold of me was just how raw someone's life is laid out in their criminal history. You get a pre-sentence investigation reports, you get the psychological reports, you get sometimes the reports of a 40-year-old man's life all the way back down to his adolescence. And acting as a lawyer, you have to read it all. You got to know every fact. You got to go through it if you're going to build a case. And time again, what I came to understand is that you just don't know what has happened to a person. You really have no idea what type of life somebody has lived. Maybe you know where they lived, and maybe you knew what it was like to celebrate their birthday with them, or talk to them at the gas station, or whatever it may be. But to actually know all the events, especially the traumatic ones that happen to people, it's just not a window that you get. And as a lawyer, sometimes you'll be, on one hand I say privileged, and on the other, it's quite a responsibility to be given that window. And you're going to see it every once in a while where a defendant that you're helping has been honest. And it's not just honest about necessarily addiction, because addiction, as I see it so often, is a secondary issue. Problems don't start with addiction. The problems begin, and then, as a secondary thing, we seek out relief in drugs, and then addiction occurs. But when you get to those reports and you really start reading about somebody's life, somebody who has sort of bared their soul to these psychologists, you realize that there's just so much trauma in our world. Trauma even, among grown men, grown women, and especially among our adolescents and our children sort of coming up in this modern day age. And, I feel like trauma, it's almost like the wind. It comes in all shapes and sizes, on all manner of occasion, and no matter its flavor, it always can find a way to push a tree down. Oftentimes, the wind, maybe it'll just test our resolve. It'll just, blow strong for a while. And then we recover. But not everybody recovers. Not from, the small winds of trauma, like shame and blame, or, those that maybe are a bit stronger. For instance, like, physical abuse, sexual abuse, just waking up every day and having to hear people argue. Many times we take all these things for granted, either because we are resilient to them ourselves or because we don't experience them, because we're not the ones, receiving those wins from those that are around us. And so, before I say too much about myself, the one thing that I would always say to remember is that you just don't know what a person has been through. And oftentimes, the people who have been through the most are those with the least to say. They just don't want to give it up. It's like speaking their own truth is almost equivalent to, turning their back on themselves in some manner. And so it's sort of like this phenomenal characteristic that I would ask you to always keep in mind when you're reviewing these cases, is allowance for that fear to be registered, to know that even if a person says they're just fine, even if a person says, well, I just like smoking dope, that there is always something there in the dark, something that is not being faced, or something that hasn't been faced with the right opportunity or the right tools to help it grow, to help bring light to that situation. Now, see, I found my way into the justice system at 9 years old. I had my first encounter with police when I was 6 for a curfew violation. In as few words as I can manage, I was a bad kid. And it started off very small, things like, family rebellion and, lying, cursing, stealing, smoking. I always had this curiosity, and it's probably the same curiosity many of you will see in the eyes of children, who are just running around trying to learn the world. But everything that I saw in the world, I wanted to be, or I wanted to try, I wanted to do it, I wanted to give it a go, okay? And unfortunately, I come from a poor socioeconomic level. My father was disabled from times before I was born. He still lives on disability. My mother, she was, a working class mother. Sometimes she would have, 3 jobs. And so we got by, but we got by the skin on our teeth, if you will. And, having, me being the only son, but also having, 4 other sisters, it complicated the mix. And so when you come from, potentially a poor economic situation, you see things that maybe others don't. You see young kids smoking cigarettes and drinking beers, or you listen to very adult music, things that, a 5, 6, 7-year-old shouldn't be listening to. You come into contact with a whole different lifestyle than maybe many people in this world see, or maybe they take for granted for. But nonetheless, you're there. The people that are there playing, whatever lewd music and smoking drugs, if you just pull back from the image a bit, their children are there too. Just circling around the edges, taking it in, seeing everything. And again, trauma, it comes in so many different shapes and sizes that it's hard to say, what will affect somebody and what won't affect somebody. And it's something, Dieter said in his conversation with us earlier, is that, growing up for him, he just felt really out of place. He felt awkward, he felt anxious, and I picked up on that as well, because as a young kid, I felt, a lot of those same things. All these things that just made me feel alone or awkward, that sent me searching for who I was and what kind of friends I was going to have. And oftentimes, those friends who I seen out, smoking marijuana or smoking cigarettes, they were a little more welcoming of me with my anxieties and my weird social cues than all the perfect people, who did everything perfectly. I found a home in people who rebelled, because when you rebel, a friend feels a lot better, to know that there's somebody there with you in that fight. And it's not something that maybe you think of as kids, or not even as adults. You sort of gravitate to somebody who struggles because you struggle. And as a kid, I felt that very same draw. And so from, just witnessing, criminality in the world around me, to then aspiring to it in, my peers, to then actually practicing it among my peers, until I knew it well enough that I could employ it on my own. That's kind of the way that I found myself into criminality. And then, I started off just feeling different and alone and anxious. But the more that I found a home in that sort of rebellious counterculture, the worse my anxiety and these feelings of dread got. And so as a means to sort of assuage this like terrible chaos that as an adolescent is just whirling within me, I of course saw drugs, afraid to speak out to anybody about my own problems, or even to ask questions about other people and their problems. There was this thing right here that they said, if you used it, you'd feel better. That's why they used it. That's why people drink beer. That's why they smoke weed. That's why they smoke cigarettes, right? It makes them feel better. So I figured, well, you know what? Maybe it'd make me feel better too. And it didn't make me feel any better. In some sense, it didn't make me feel anything at all. And what it certainly led me to was more drugs and harder drugs. And so whereas, my first encounter with marijuana and alcohol was very young, like 6 or 7 years old, just sort of trying it, with older friends who were obviously, led, wayward. That was the beginning. And then as I grew older, you got to step it up. My issues had not been fixed. The issues that led me to use drugs had not been fixed. And anything that lies unfixed, you'll know, just complicates, especially when it's inside your mind or your heart. And so it complicated me all the way to being a cocaine addict at the age of 15. And, sure, there's a list of drugs by the age of 15 that I could tell you that I've done, but, no doubtedly, the most prominent point is that I had probably been awake for 2.5 days on cocaine leading up to my crime. And my crime also involved somebody coming to sell me drugs. I was in a drug deal that I decided to rob and viciously beat another man with a pistol. And so, it's just always important to try and find the source of someone's trauma. And one thing you can always guarantee is if you're in the legal system and you're hired to help somebody in whatever capacity, they need it. They need you not only to listen, but also to speak for them. And in some sense, to speak beyond what they say. It's like as a lawyer or a judge or a prosecutor, you're almost like an artist. where the defendant or whatever person, the victim maybe even, who is in need of help, they start the sentence, but you have to finish it. They'll give you just a little bit, and if you don't grab a hold and you don't keep asking and you don't keep following the path, then it'll just drop back down inside their minds. You really have to try and help people as best you can. And I'm, a hard-on crime advocate. I was given 36 years for my crimes at the age of 15, and I never called it unjust. I thought it was quite appropriate for my crimes and my criminal history, and the only important thing to me was getting out of prison quicker. So I don't mean to get up here and call on you to sort of bring in, a soft-on-crime future. That's not necessarily what I'm looking for, but I want to just be as real with you as possible in hopes that you can find that authenticity one-on-one with your client, where you can see yourself not only as a lawyer, but as a physician of the soul, somebody who is placed in this special relationship between a person and moral virtue, where you step in and you help them to achieve what all of us in life are trying to find. You are their special guide at that point, and your only job is to help them, even, if they're just knuckleheads, even if they're covered in tattoos, even if they're, black, blue, white, orange, yellow, tall, small, short, to see them dead in the eye, and in that eye to recognize the similarity that we all have beneath the skin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Miles. That was a really great share, and appreciate your candor. All right, I think we will open it up to questions. We did have some questions submitted.
So for me, I wouldn't say that it was any one particular person, but I had, a number of people that were really pulling for me in my corner. So for me, it was, sort of a unified front, a handful of people who I could always call and depend on. And then at the same time, I owe a great debt to, my prosecutor, who ultimately allowed for me to be released early. And one thing, that he did was hear me out. And he asked me, what was my plan? What did I want to do, and why did I want to do it? And it was such a fair and honest thing for him to ask me that, and for me to be able to reply to that. And so, I presented him my plan of how, I wanted to re-enter society and where I wanted to re-enter, which was a very particular thing for me because I went in at the age of 15 and I got out at the age of 27. And so, I went in as, someone's son, and I got out a grown man. So, what he allowed for me to do is sort of structure my own release so that I stepped down from prison to a work release facility, to then house arrest, and finally, ultimately, to my freedom. And I really appreciated that, alongside, all the small things and the support that all my friends and family gave me.
Okay, so I'll combine these two. The biggest misconception that the public has about either incarceration or addiction, that you'd like to dispel, or that you have a different take on?
Yeah, so I'll take that question. No one else jumps. So the biggest misconception that the public has about addiction, in my opinion, it would have to involve neurology, or how the mind works. How your mind and its neurons communicate with one another. And so if you're going into the legal field, I would certainly advocate that you read some about neurology. And there's one great book, and it's free on Google to read it online, and it's called Behave. And it's, this brilliant book written by a brilliant guy and I believe his name was Sapolsky. Came out probably within the last 5 years, and it talks about how we form habits in our minds, and how these are genuinely, they're like organic walkways. If you walk a path through the woods, ultimately there will be a path there. And it's kind of the same how your mind works, that when you do something over and over and over again, it creates a circuit in your mind. And the more you do it, the easier it is to walk through it. Whereas, something that's brand new to you, it might be quite hard to do the first time because there's no circuit. It's almost like the famous quote that says, two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. New things are routes untraveled, so they're very hard the first times. And habits are things that we travel multiple times. We continue to do them, and they're reinforced in our minds. And now you can change your neurology. You can change, how you interact with these habits, but it takes a very conscious effort to overwrite them. And so the thing for me is knowing how somebody can overwrite this habit, what they actually need to do to change the neurons in their own minds. And what it comes down to is action. If you want to get rid of one habit, then you need to get them doing something else. And eventually, just as the forest will overtake the path, so will the network inside their mind shrink and disappear. But you have to keep them focused on something new. And that's true with addiction as much as it is criminality in general, because people are addicted to actions and behaviors. And so for me, it's the lack of application in our programming. Even, if it's an AA meeting, for instance, or if it's, some group on criminality, offered inside an institution, so much of it is just talking rather than actually doing. And you can meet with a group and do things. You can interact as a community. You can play games. For me, there's just a lot of application lacking in the context that we're currently offering our help. And I think that, if we can come to better understand how these patterns of behavior set themselves inside our minds, then we'll take a more informed approach in eradicating those old networks and helping to enliven the new ones that we wish to implant.
I will go to Dennis for a question before returning to the RSVP questions.
Hi, I'm bringing this question more in the recovery side of things. I have several friends under the burden of felony and trying to get on with their lives. And I really see the unfairness of it, just like all of you already said. And I think a clear path to expungement is really one of the best things that we can do in the near future to let people get on with their lives, because living under that burden, I know from my friends, puts them perilously close to going back to crimes and using and things. So what would you think is a suitable condition for expungement? Like, a certain amount of time clean, or a certain amount of time something, or the severity of the crime. I mean, what would you think would be suitable to say, yes, this deserves expungement of the felony?
What is the right path to expungement? So if I'm going to ask the question, I'm sort of going to compare it to, I'm going to compare the process of expungement to the process of sentence modification. When you're incarcerated, a sentence modification is like the holy grail. It's this uber rare thing that people just pray to get, and everybody tries for it, but it just never comes. And so, the expungement process is like the sentence modification process in that it is there within the law. It's something that they are allowed to do, but it's something that is hardly ever done. You put in for expungement, you get denied. You put in for a sentence modification, you get denied. And so you start to ask yourself, like, well, what are these processes for? They have a prosecution process, and that one is used fairly liberally all the time. Why is an expungement process or a sentence modification process not being used? And so, I don't think that there's one way to expungement. There are, sort of countless reasons that a person will ask for expungement. And no doubt, those reasons all are, probably good reasons, the accolades that they have sort of collected after their incarceration or addiction, all the great things that they've been doing. But I wouldn't say that there's any one route, except that we recognize the one route. It's like, we can talk about, well, I would like, to be free of my criminal history and I'd like to do this, but we're not putting in for an expungement. And not a lot of people are. But I feel like if there were more of a campaign, more of an awareness on what expungement looks like and, how to get there, the paperwork that needs to be filled out, sort of advocates to help with that paperwork, then we may be able to, start seeing it a lot more. But first, we just have to try. And I feel like that's a hurdle that most of us aren't even getting to. I mean, I, for one, haven't, filed an expungement, although it's certainly been at the back of my mind. And I've never known someone to. But what I do know with these motions and these laws and, when you file a motion and they say no, you just got to keep filing them. And eventually, we might be able to open up that channel so that there's enough attention on it that they just can't keep denying people. That maybe they'll bring their bar down. Because no matter what, you can readily guess that there's somebody right now in your state that deserves expungement. They're there right now. Who are they? Why hasn't it occurred yet? Is somebody helping them? And so until we sort of like take that next step to bring the people who are ready now, I just can't get on to the sort of discussion of how to change it, because we just don't even know what it looks like. It's just some like black and white process in the law books that is never really done.
Thank you. Mallory?
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. This has all been fantastic. So me personally, I'm going to law school because I want to become a prosecutor eventually that's mindful of defendants' needs to try to prevent some of the atrocities that we see within the system. And I know, Miles, you said that you had a prosecutor that really seemed to care about your future and what you were going through. So I just wanted to ask all of you, did you have other good experiences with your prosecutor, or did you have a bad one? And then what would you recommend people who want to become prosecutors keep in mind as they go into the field?
So I would say that the only positive experience, other than receiving the justice I certainly deserved, the only positive experience that I've had with somebody from the prosecutorial side was this one head prosecutor. And now why I'm going to point him out so distinctly is because, I had fought for my freedom for years. As I sort of grew up in the maximum security prison in which I lived, doing all the programming, doing every program that was available to me in a place like that, did it. Went back for a sentence modification, was basically told that I was a terrorist and that I had no hope and that I should just go back and shut my door. And that was basically the response I got was, that's great. Don't care about what you did in there. You're there, so see you later. Which was very heartbreaking for me because, from the moment that I walked in, the only thing I could think about was trying to get out early. Because, who wants to be in prison? And the only way to get out early was to do good things and then go back on sentence modification because that's what that avenue was meant for. So the first prosecutor I ran into, like I said, basically just shot me down on the spot. Well, luckily for me, the people spoke and he was ousted in the next election. So I quickly followed up with the new prosecutor, wrote him a letter, explained to him who I was, and at the very end of it said, at the very least, just come talk to me. If you don't do anything else, just have a conversation with me in person, because that's going to tell you more about me than I ever could in a letter. And to his character, he did. He did have a conversation with myself and my lawyer on multiple occasions, and we got to know one another. And so it was such an honest thing for me to get that interaction with this prosecutor. And I felt like, in many respects, I would have benefited just as much from it even early on, as I went through the adversarial process, to just be able to talk to these people, whether it be the judge or the prosecutor, who were trying to take my life away, because I just couldn't quite understand it as a defendant, and particularly not as an adolescent defendant. So that was certainly the best experience that I had with a prosecutor.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Mallory, for the question. Evan?
Hi. Thank you guys for talking. I have a policy question. So I was just generally wondering what your ideas are on, I guess this is becoming more popular nowadays, this idea of abolitionism. And I also wanted to touch again on this idea of prosecutors and police officers. We've covered that they have this like immense privilege and responsibility to positively impact people's lives. And it seems like all three of you might have had some positive experiences with prosecutors, but at the same time, they're prescribed with the job of putting people into jail rather than trying to fix the system itself. They're kind of subscribing to the incarceration system. And my personal belief is that there just needs to be more focus on mending societal structures that might cause people to commit crimes in the first place. I do believe that dangerous people should not be in society, that they should be removed, but I think there needs to be more focus on structures that would limit crime in the first place, like education and therapy. And there needs to be less of a focus on actually prosecution and police force. So just your thoughts on that.
All right. So on the topic of abolitionism, I'm fairly partial to abolitionists. If you look up the term, on Google or something, it'll say, people who don't believe in imprisonment or, prisons or whatever it may be. There's a lot of different definitions and even more when you talk to individual people. But a lot of people that I've talked to that believe in abolitionism or the sort of displacement of modern day prisons, they'll kind of tell you like this: yeah, I want to do away with these prisons, but I don't know, what I want to replace them with. And so, what they know is the current system is not the right system. And they're searching for an answer to solve it. And I'm partial to that because, in my life, one of the things that I'm pursuing is actually trying to build a new model of prison. And I would still call it prison, but I would argue that in some sense, building this new type of prison is an abolishment of the old type. And in that way, I'm very familiar to the abolitionist movement. But then I would also say that, whereas you said we should focus on mending societal structures, it's like you can mend societal structures, you can convict and punish people, or you can rehabilitate people. And I would agree with you that a lot of times, so much goes into the conviction process and the prosecutors and the police force, that not enough time or maybe not enough resources are being given to mending the societal structures that sort of bring criminality out of us, the social and cultural habits, if you will. So I totally agree with you there. And then I would just push you to look a little further. You're sort of looking at, pre-incarceration. So, what leads them to that event, the event of conviction. But then I would push you, to look further into that abolitionist movement and the post-incarceration experience. And I might even bring attention to, and this is something I think everyone, should pay attention to, is the condition of our confinement institutions, our departments of confinement. What do those prisons really look like? So much talk goes towards the adversarial process where someone's getting convicted, or the process beforehand where they're out committing crimes, and not enough attention, I think, is paid to the condition of our confinement facilities. Because each one of those facilities is a city inside of a city. It has its own culture, its own norms. The things that you experience and expect every day are far different than those you might experience or expect in the free world. And so for me, having spent so much time confined, the real problem that sort of pairs with mending our flawed societal structures is mending our flawed incarceral structures. That if a person can't get right on their own beforehand, then we should have the system set up in such a way as to catch them as they fall, catching them, with whatever sentence they have, catching them and then being able to provide them with the resources to become the person that we want them to be, an upstanding citizen to our society. And how can you ever expect somebody to learn how to adhere to your societal regulations and norms by sentencing them to live in an environment, a world that is so unlike our societal norms and expectations that it's not even funny? They couldn't adhere before going to prison, and then once they get to prison, they're beset on all sides by this crazy culture of drugs, gangs, and violence, that it's almost imaginable that a person standing there could get over all of that nonsense just to get back to us healed. It's just not happening like that. And so I would just take note of that as well.
Thank you very much for your responses. Lorraine, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah, that was right. Thank you. Just want to say thank you, three gentlemen, for being here today, for your insights, your time, and especially your vulnerability. I'm sure that this is, bringing up some stuff for you guys. So I appreciate you being here and inviting us. I think I'm a really big advocate for prison reform and bond reform. And I think in today's society, we're still seeing the effects of Nixon's and Reagan's era with the war on drugs and mass incarceration in terms of judges and prosecutors and people that are still on the bench. And I was just wondering if this has sort of inspired any of y'all to get into any sort of local politics or policies to try to educate more people about these policies and mass incarceration and what it's doing to society. And if it hasn't inspired you, if it's something you haven't really quite thought of yet, would that be something that you guys would be interested in?
Yeah, so my journey certainly has inspired me to become involved in, you might call it politics, but in just helping people. If you ask Aristotle what his definition of politics was, he'll tell you that politics, the word polis, was just when you came into contact with somebody else. So any kind of conversation between two people was political. And it still is political today. And so whether, the politics that I pursue or Nick or Dita pursue, no matter where they're at, whether it be a gym or a street corner or a courthouse, I think we're all, very well sort of wrapped up in the politics of our own lives and trying to help people, where we can. And I do public speaking And for Dieter and Nick, I mean, if it's something that they're interested in, you guys can always contact me, and I can sort of explain how you go about reaching out to different places. But I reach out to different organizations. I put in for keynote speaking positions. I just Google different events, different key tag words around criminality and justice, and just see what comes up, because you kind of just got to throw it out there and go with it. But my experience, more than anything, is what has sort of propelled me into that light. That when I was incarcerated, there were just a whole slew of people, and sometimes just random strangers that helped me. That offered a hand, when you never expected it, and that was sort of the kindness, one piece at a time, that allowed me to get out of that dark place and to overcome all them habits. And it wasn't just one person or 1 year. I mean, it was every single person, and each year, over the years, they were all instrumental at that time and place for me. And now that I'm sort of better, I hope to, replicate that behavior. I want to be that same person, helping others sort of get along in their lives and find happiness. So certainly, it's pushed me, and if there's ever an opportunity at Wayne Law for something like this again, no doubt, all of us would be more than happy to come back and do some sort of other symposium. So thank you for the question.
In response to that, I've received an alarming amount of private messages asking if we can do this again. So I think we'll definitely do something like this again. If anyone wants to unmute and have a couple words to say, feel free before we hop off.
Yeah, thanks to all three of you. I don't want to repeat everything Marie just said, but I imagine it wasn't easy, but you've done us all a great service by sharing your stories, and it's I think we'll take this into our professional lives, and it'll stick with us, and hopefully make a difference. So thank you.
Thank you.